colleagues, I'm very much delighted to welcome you to a very interesting side event here at the COP56, not at the COP, at the SB 56 here in Bonn. The subject is a very serious one. We are going to talk about methane. And the title of our side event is the Global Methane Pledge, From Assessment to Action, Science, Planning and Implementation. My name is Vera Scholz. I'm working with the GIZ, and I'm a head for climate change in Asia and in Latin America. The side event is a hybrid one. That means we are here in presence, but we also have an audience in the virtual room, and we also have one of our panelists here in the virtual room, and I will introduce him to you later on. We will have an opening remark, opening speech. We will have a discussion here with my dear panelists, and then I hope we also can come at the end to the questions of the audience. The short-lived climate pollutant, methane, originates mainly from anthropogenic sources and contributes approximately 20% to greenhouse gas effect. As a warming potential is about 20 times higher than that of CO2. This is why I said that this is a serious subtopic we are discussing today. Due to its climate-forcing ability and the rise in concentration, methane has recently gained much more attention. Politically, the most important initiative is the Global Methane Pledge, which was launched at the COP in Glasgow last year, and will also play a significant role at the COP27. We will hear from, during this side event, about the latest political developments and scientific findings. We will hear about the organization of the implementation of the Global Methane Pledge, and we also will have some first practical examples from all over the world. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Lily Bermel for the opening speech. You are with the US Department of State. You are an advisor in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate and the Office of Global Change at the US Department of State. You're working mainly on capacity development and mitigation negotiations at the UNFCCC, and it's a pleasure to have you here. And before you joined the UNFCCC, here the negotiations and the Department of State, you also advised the Kingdom of Tonga, and you also have been working in one of the federal states in the US. Yeah, so you will set the scene. Floor is yours, Lily.
Sure. Thank you very much for that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I know we're all methane enthusiasts to be here, so I hope not to repeat too much of what you already know. But today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis of the Global Methane Pledge, the science behind it, its very crucial connectivity to energy security, and then also its connection to the COP and the broader UNFCCC process. So as in the introduction stated, I'm part of the climate team at the U.S. Department of State, which is currently being led by Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, and we are all very passionate about climate in the SPEC office. So we know that the science is really clear that reducing methane emissions is critical to limiting warming to 1.5 with limited overshoot. And the Global Methane Pledge is really something that put methane on the global spotlight for climate action. As was stated, the US and the EU announced the Global Methane Pledge at the World Leaders Summit back in November. And we actually, back when this was started, it was almost a napkin idea. And so back in August, just a few months before, we had just started with just about 8 countries. And then by September, we grew to 32. And by October, we were nearing the 110 that we announced at COP. And so right now, we've gained more members, and pretty soon there's going to be an announcement of a new tranche of endorsers, which is really exciting. So we know that methane comes from primarily 3 sources. Agriculture, fossil fuel leaks, and waste have contributed 0.5 degrees of Celsius warming, global warming to date, which is about half of the global warming that's occurred. Achieving the Global Methane Pledge collective goal of reducing methane emissions 30% by 2030 could reduce warming by at least 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2050. And this is a really critically important fact, not only because of the avoided warming potential by achieving this collective goal, but because of the short-term impact that it has. This is 0.2 degrees Celsius of warming this decade. And so not only does that avoid warming, right, but it opens the door to allow for more time for more sustained reductions in carbon dioxide. Cutting methane emissions in line with that can also reduce peak levels of warming, avert tipping points, and reduce global adaptation burdens, all while alleviating climate impacts. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, estimates that achieving the Global Methane Pledge would prevent more than 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from reaching the atmosphere annually by 2030. So it is pretty clear from that methane mitigation is regarded as the single most effective strategy to limiting warming and keeping the global goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. And it also has co-benefits in improving public health and agricultural productivity. So specifically, achieving the Global Methane Pledge each year could prevent 170,000 premature deaths, 510,000 asthma-related hospital visits, 48 billion hours of lost labor from extreme heat, and 17 million tons of crop losses globally. So that 0.2 degrees Celsius really makes a difference. Yet at the same time, the world is reaching record high concentrations of methane, and emissions, as we know, are still increasing at record speed. So it's going to take all of our efforts to bend this curve, slow the rate of emissions increase, and achieve that methane reductions in line with the Global Methane Pledge. I wanted to address its connection to energy security because it presents a really key and important opportunity that we can take advantage of given all the changing global events, but also this Africa COP that's upcoming. So methane emissions from the oil and gas sector are actually the cheapest to abate because the sector has among the fastest and most cost-effective solutions that are presently available today to reduce methane. The IEA estimates that nearly half of all methane emissions in the oil and gas sector can be abated at no net cost. No net cost. This is because the value of the captured methane could cover the abatement costs. So essentially, instead of increasing production to meet energy demands or to offset one country's fossil fuels, we can capture the methane that's getting released, and then you reduce emissions, you have more gas to use, and you're not increasing production, you're not increasing emissions. And if you deploy renewables as well, that's another way to offset natural gas. In fact, the total volume of flared gas globally is equal to the amount of gas that the EU imports from Russia. So I'll say that again. The total volume of flared gas, that's wasted gas and all of those methane emissions, is equal to the amount of gas that the EU imports from Russia. So capturing all of this flared, vented, and leaked methane is a true prize. It reduces methane, as I said, and it doesn't increase production. And so if we focus specifically on Europe and North Africa, almost as a case study and a really key opportunity, you recognize the climate, the energy, and the economic benefits from this. And so for Egypt, our office has estimated that their gas that gets flared, vented, and leaked is equivalent to about 1/3 of their gas exports. And then at the current EU gas import prices, if we capture all of that gas, it could be worth over $4 billion in annual revenue. And then at the same time, this can go towards Europe. And also, this is pretty on the easier end to do because many of the pipelines in North Africa have spare capacity. Some of these pipelines only operate at about a 50% utilization rate. So this gives space for very commercially attractive projects, which is something that we're in conversation with the government of Egypt about and is clearly a key thing going forward. So this shows that energy security is a complement to climate action, and it's definitely not an alternative, and it's a way to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And And then I also just wanted to kind of wrap it up by connecting the Global Methane Pledge, but more methane action, to the UNFCCC process writ large. In our office, we kind of joke about how there's two COPs. There's the COP and the COP. One of those is the negotiations that goes on and the more formal process, and the other is the action-forcing, really media, public-facing event that happens around the COP. And so both of these can connect to the COP. And so kind of what I just outlined when it comes to the North Africa-Europe opportunity and the energy security opportunity with methane is really important to capitalize on, because this is an Africa COP. And with that public-facing event, we can really show that energy security and climate go hand in hand and are really not conflicting at all. So that's on that end. And when it comes to the other COP, the negotiations COP, there's kind of two key opportunities where it relates, and it gets a little bit technical, but I assume you guys are interested. But the first is under the Paris Transparency and Reporting Framework. So back at COP24, we finished the MRV, the Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification Guidelines, and then at COP26, we figured out how to operationalize it. And basically what that means is that all countries under the Paris Agreement are required to submit the same tables for inventories for their greenhouse gases, and methane is one of those 7 gases. So for some countries, the GMP is actually the first opportunity that they have to take significant action on methane policy-wise in the domestic or international space. And so obviously a first step to doing that is having your inventories and having your reporting in line. And so parties are first required to submit these inventories by 2024, and this is just a wonderful first step to kind of get everyone on board and able to take action on methane, whether or not they're signed on to the GMP. And then secondly, and then last note before I wrap up, is there's a new mitigation work program that COP26 authorized, and it's quite nascent, but its mandate is to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. So I've been participating in those negotiations this session, and so parties are still debating, its scope, its modalities, the topics it should take up. But if done right, essentially, it's a really key opportunity to standardize best practices for mitigation, ambition, and implementation. And so surely, as I've outlined today, methane is exactly one of those best practices. So we hope to see something advanced in that space, but that will come next year once the work program is actually launched. So just to conclude, thank you for listening, but I know you guys all know that it's critical to act on methane as it works for the energy, development, climate agendas, basically everything. And so we really can't afford to wait to take really fast and urgent action. And the Global Methane Pledge is obviously a key avenue to do that. So thank you for all of your work that you guys contribute, and to the panelists as well. And I'll hand it back over to you, and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Lily. That sounds good. No net costs, isn't it? I mean, this is very promising. And thank you also to reminding of how the making of the pledge in Glasgow happened. You also mentioned already some of the sources, energy as well as waste. And what is a bit the sad side of the story is that the methane emissions are still increasing. And now I would like to thank you again that you have been here with us, or you are still here with us. And I would like to hand over to Kathleen Marr. Let me introduce our first panelist to you, all of you. Kathleen is working at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, which is a nice town close to Berlin. And Kathleen, you are an atmospheric chemist with a PhD with a strong expertise on methane. You are leading an interdisciplinary research team which is called Climate Action in National and International Processes at your institute, and you have done research most recently, and there is a paper which is called Beyond CO2 Equivalence, the Impacts of Methane on Climate Ecosystems and Health, published in Environmental Science and Policy. Now, we are very curious to hear what science currently says about methane, and you have very interesting findings for us, I guess. The floor is yours, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. So Lily already mentioned some of the important scientific points. So there's really like 2 major scientific takeaways that I want to emphasize here. One is that methane mitigation is urgent. I think we know that, but it's worth repeating. So Lily mentioned emissions are still increasing. Right now, if you look at the emissions profile, we're tracking some of the worst IPCC scenarios. It's not looking good. Atmospheric methane concentrations are increasing more rapidly than they've been in the past 40 years. Atmospheric methane has more than doubled since pre-industrial times. So this is something that we urgently need to address for climate, but also for other reasons. And the second point I want to make is that methane is not CO2, which sounds trivial and obvious, but it's important here because methane's impacts are not well covered by this concept of CO2 equivalence. So I think most of you know CO2 equivalence is calculated based on the 100-year climate impact of methane, but also other greenhouse gases. This is important. But in the case of methane, arguably the most important thing is its near-term climate impact. That means in the next 20 years. So Lily mentioned this as well. If we are able to cut our methane emissions, we can feel the impacts in our lifetime. It's a really important opportunity to reduce warming and also in the near term, whereas CO2 emissions reductions just take longer to have an effect because of its long atmospheric lifetime. The other way, another very important way that methane is not the same as CO2 and not well represented by the concept of CO2 equivalence is its impact on air pollution via the production of tropospheric ozone. So this is also something that Lily mentioned and that I want to highlight. So methane leads to the production of tropospheric ozone. Tropospheric ozone is an air pollutant. It's bad for our health. It causes asthma, especially in children. It leads to premature deaths. So that should also be motivation to mitigate methane emissions. And ozone not only damages our lungs when we breathe it in, tropospheric ozone, but it also damages crops, leading to these agricultural impacts. And of course, the important thing is to reduce methane here, but methane is not treated under air quality frameworks. So other precursors to tropospheric ozone are being reduced worldwide because of air quality regulations, but there's a gap there. Methane is not treated under air quality, it's treated under climate. So this is also something to pay attention to. I will stop there and pass it back to you, Vera. I'm sure we're going to hear more about ways to address this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I was also not very much aware that there is such a strong relationship to ozone. And also, Lily, you mentioned already the impacts on health we are facing. Anything else we should know from the perspective of science, which is important for us to remind? Do you have, Kathleen?
Looking forward under climate change, it's also important to consider that there are natural sources of methane that can also result in increased natural emissions. For instance, from wetlands. Wetlands, of course, are impacted by many factors, including soil temperature, water availability. All of these factors are also impacted by climate change, so we need to be careful and keep that in the back of our mind. It just kind of underscores the message of urgency to reduce as much warming as we possibly can now via reducing our anthropogenic methane emissions.
But it's still the fact that emissions from, as Lily said, energy as well as waste is bigger than the emissions which is now coming from the wetlands or maybe the permafrost which is melting. Is that the case currently?
I'd have to get the percentages in front of my nose to say the exact numbers. But right now, anthropogenic emissions are in total more. I think it's about 60%, but I'll let somebody else fact check that, or I'll do that in a minute and get back to you. But yes, anthropogenic methane emissions absolutely need to be reduced from methane, from methane, of course, from the fossil fuel industry, from the waste sector, and also from agriculture, which is an important issue that's a little bit more tricky from the policy standpoint.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Now we come to an overview of national climate policy planning and ways to how to increase ambition levels here in the space of methane. And I would like to introduce to you to our virtual panelist, that is Johan Schurlen-Scherner. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. You are at the Stockholm Environmental Institute joining us here in the virtual space. Johan, you are a research leader at the York Center of the Stockholm Environment Institute and a reader at the University of York. You are a member of the scientific advisory panel of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, CCAC, and you are an author of the CCAC UNEP Global Methane Assessment, benefits and costs of mitigating methane emissions. So a real specialist, as well as Kathleen and Lily. As an expert on short-lived climate pollutants, you are co-developer of the SLCP strategy support tool being used by many, many governments to develop national integrated air pollution and climate change mitigation strategies. Now, Johan, it would be very interesting for us to hear from you. Currently, with the Global Methane Pledge, we have a lot of international momentum, which not only started in Glasgow, but a bit before. We have also, in addition to the Global Methane Pledge, we have philanthropic funds. We have the leadership of the US and the EU in this topic. We have the engagement of the CCAC. But in your experience, is this also now reflected already in the national climate policy planning of the countries which have been part of the pledge? And how can this level of mitigation pledge be increased? Johan, floor is yours. You are behind me, so I cannot really see you.
Yeah. So
but
I assume you
please,
can hear me
we are very
okay.
curious to listen to you.
Well, one way to look at this is to look at how countries have represented methane in their nationally determined contribution plans. So some of the work that we at SEI and the CCAC have undertaken has considered all of the methane-related mitigation options which are mentioned by countries in their current NDCs. So from this analysis, we can see that if the measures in the NDCs that are there that will reduce methane emissions are fully implemented in the countries, so 100% implemented in the countries that included them in their NDCs, then the methane emissions globally would reduce by about 30%. So that means that if countries do all they can to implement the measures that they said they will implement, then the pledge can be achieved by the NDC commitments. So that's very positive. It means we can get to the 30% reduction through the measures that countries globally have already said that they're going to commit to implementing. But this only works if they will 100% implement all of those measures in each country. But the problem is that countries don't give any indication of how much these measures are going to be implemented in their NDCs, and they include the methane in the catch-all CO2 equivalent number for all GHG mitigation. So if we go a bit further into that analysis, if we count up all of the measures in all of the countries that have mentioned them in their NDCs, we get 482 mitigation actions, which are already included in NDCs, that need to be fully implemented to achieve the reduction needed by the GMP. So when we look into these measures, we get more of an insight into how the level of mitigation could be achieved. So about half of the reduction, so the 15% or the 30, is achieved from just 13 mitigation actions in major emitting countries and sectors. So this would include reducing coal mine methane in China, fugitive oil and gas in the US, Middle East and Nigeria, reductions in the waste sector emissions of India and the EU, and in agricultural emissions in the US. And when looking at those 482 mitigation actions, it's interesting to see that about 42% of those have been committed to by non-GMP pledged countries. So it's not just about countries who've signed up to the GMP doing what they can, but it's a global effort to make sure these are reduced, whether they join the GMP or not. So back to you.
Thank you. You told us that countries will need to increase the level of mitigation to achieve the methane pledge. So what different pathways could they follow?
Well, so there's a big assumption made in this analysis that countries are going to implement the measures that they mentioned in their NDCs to the fullest extent possible. But even if they don't implement these by 100%, there are other opportunities to meet the pledge that are not being pursued at the moment in NDCs, but which offer substantial additional abatement. So if we look into those, there are different ways that you could achieve the methane pledge if we don't implement to 100% those pledges, the NDC actions that have been committed to, or to go beyond that level of mitigation to ensure that we try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. So firstly, we could take further action in more countries in key emitting sectors. So far, less than half of the countries have included specific methane measures in their NDCs. So there's a great opportunity to increase more. For example, if all the countries were to implement one further measure, then this could add to another 30% reduction in emissions. Secondly, we could get countries with large emissions to reduce methane. So the major emitters who have signed up to the methane pledge only include measures covering about 60% of their emissions. And so there's much more room to do more. And some large emitting countries only include measures that cover less than half of their emissions. So if you apply measures to the top 10 emitting countries in all sectors, this would provide another 20% emission reduction. We also need to encourage, as I said, the action in the non-GMP countries as well as GMP. But we also can encourage action on specific sectors. It was mentioned that reducing emissions from oil and gas is seen as a quick win. But 40% of emissions in this sector are not covered by stated emission mitigation measures in NDCs. So if you applied measures to all countries with oil and gas, that could provide another 7% reduction in methane emissions. So there are different ways by which we could try and ensure that the 30% is achieved or go beyond more than 30%. And there's real advantages to collective action globally.
Good, thank you. So it's also interesting to know, I mean, we have a lot of countries who are part of the Global Methane Pledge, but not all of them, and they are also very important. And what is still a little bit missing is that there are not, in many cases, not many very specific measures that the countries have already on the radar. So we can see that there are multiple pathways to bridge the gap between current plans and the pledge, but how to get there? What kind of methods, Johan, and tools can help to show countries what the benefits of action can be? And I mentioned that you have been working on a tool which might be of interest here for the audience.
Yes, but before I talk about that tool, I'd just like to mention that the measures don't only reduce methane emissions, the measures that are applied, they can also help different aspects of sustainable development. And we need to identify these multiple benefits to be able to promote the ambition and action on methane. So as well as technical measures to reduce methane, there are other measures such as changes in behavior. This would include reducing waste generation or reducing red meat consumption. And these measures are barely included in any NDCs at the moment. So it's a real missed opportunity because the measures have the ability not only to reduce methane, but at the same time achieve different benefits across sustainable development goals, such as if you reduce red meat consumption, that will reduce methane, of course, but it also has health benefits by reducing heart disease and cancer. Reducing methane emissions from waste as part of development activities, providing modern waste systems will enhance development, improve health, as well as reduce methane, and employ more people in formalized waste management. And it can also help to achieve SDGs on sustainable production and consumption and efficient resource use. So if you could increase the mitigation ambition through these types of measures, then the NDCs could be transformed from just addressing climate to achieving other health and circular economy strategies, as well as air pollution, as we discussed with ozone. Now, there are many different tools and methods to quantify methane mitigation, which can also quantify multiple benefits. But the first key tool to achieve these plans and the pledge is transparency. So at the moment, the reporting is in terms of CO2 equivalents. And so countries really need to communicate transparently their methane reduction in tons. So that's one of the first things, I think that was mentioned. The second tool that links to transparency is supporting countries to enhance their capacity to undertake this multiple benefit assessment of methane mitigation. And there are many benefits of NDC actions. It's important to show how reducing methane is also about achieving national development goals. So alongside methane mitigation, there are many economic, human health, social crop productivity and other benefits that can be achieved. And you need tools to be able to look at those benefits. So as you mentioned, SEI produces the low emissions analysis platform, LEAP-IBC, to help quantify the multiple benefits of actions. And if I can just mention a couple of examples. The first is that we use this tool to quantify methane as well as other greenhouse gas and air pollution emission reductions during the update of Côte d'Ivoire's NDC. So LEAP-IBC was used to quantify methane emissions in oil and gas extraction, agriculture and waste, and evaluated the emission reductions and benefits that would result from the implementation of the measures. As a result of this modelling, national total methane emissions could be reduced by 30% by 2030 through the implementation of 38 mitigation measures committed to in Côte d'Ivoire's NDC. And in addition to methane emission reductions, the measures would benefit Ivorians locally. 7,000 deaths would be avoided by NDC implementation, and the plans include 12 new managed landfill sites improving waste management. And then another example is that we're currently working with the Pollution Control Department in Thailand to support national planning, where we're using LEAP-IBC to develop a comprehensive database considering air pollution, GHG and SLSP mitigation. As part of this, given that Thailand is a major rice producer, we're looking into the further implementation of alternate wetting and drying in paddy rice production. And what's interesting here is that it's the Pollution Control Department doing this. They're not responsible for the GHG mitigation, but they see the power of dealing with these issues in an integrated way, and tools like LEAP-IBC can help to showcase and identify and quantify that.
Thank you so much, Johan. And now we come to very practical questions of transparency reporting. And you just mentioned Thailand, where you have been working. And I think we can see a little film now from our colleagues in Thailand and how they are measuring certain things. I hope this is working out. There's a colleague of mine who is trying to initiate this. Let's be a little bit patient. Not yet.
In Thailand, the agricultural sector is the second biggest greenhouse gas emitting sector after energy. And out of that, more than half of these emissions comes from rice production. Luckily, there's a simple technology that can reduce these emissions.
We can hear something.
Instead of having the rice field continuously flooded like in traditional rice production, the farmer can let the field dry out 2 to 3 times during the season. We call it alternate wetting and drying, and without reducing yields. This simple practice can reduce methane emissions with up to 70%.
Under the Thai-German climate program, the Rice Department and GIZ have worked to introduce a measurement, reporting, and verification system for the rice sector to show the impacts of climate-smart rice farming on greenhouse gas emissions. Equipment has been provided to rice research centers for collection and analysis of emissions data from rice fields. A tool to calculate emissions and mitigation potentials from rice cultivation nationwide is developed, and estimated mitigation potentials are being verified with data from farmers applying low emission practices.
สำหรับขั้นตอนนะครับก็คือจะเริ่มจากการจัดทำแปลงการเลือกแปลงนะครับจากนั้นจะทำการเก็บก๊าซโดยใช้เทคนิค closed chamber นะครับหรือเป็นการใช้กล่องปิดนะครับเพื่อเก็บก๊าซแล้วก็นำไปวิเคราะห์ในห้องแลบนะครับด้วยเครื่อง gas chromatography นะครับ
การดำเนินงานในพื้นที่นำร่องของโครงการโดยศูนย์วิจัยข้าวและศูนย์เมล็ดพันธุ์ข้าวในพื้นที่ต่างๆที่ภายใต้โครงการที่เกี่ยวข้องงานด้านงานวิจัยและการตรวจวัดก๊าซเรือนกระจกเหล่านี้ได้บูรณาการทั้งสาขาทรัพยากรธรรมชาติและสิ่งแวดล้อมโดยผลการตรวจวัดก๊าซเรือนกระจกจะช่วยสนับสนุนพันธกิจในการจัดทำบัญชีก๊าซเรือนกระจกของภาคการผลิตข้าวตอบสนองนโยบายด้านการเปลี่ยน
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that gave us a bit of a clue how, at least in the field of rice production, we can do some measurements. We will have two more films later on, and somehow it's going to work. But first, let me turn to Nathan Bockfold-Parnell. You're working with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, CCAC, and CCAC plays a very important role in the implementation of the Global Methane Pledge. So you are an environmental attorney and a scientist with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, as I said, leading on Science Affair and its methane flagship. And you are co-author of the 2021 Global Methane Assessment, a very important document. Prior to joining the CCAC, you spent 8 years negotiating the Montreal Protocol, which is about ozone protection, and the UNFCCC on behalf of small island development states. Thank you so much. And now you are going to explain about a roadmap, if I understand correctly.
Yes, thank you. And are the slides? Oh, there are slides up. Okay. But first, I always feel like I don't give people enough information in my bio after I hear Johan, the miles of things that he's done. I'm a co-author on the paper that he's just discussed as well, but I want to make sure people know that. So I'm a science affairs coordinator at the CCAC. I do quite a bit about methane and planning around the implementation and operationalizing the Global Methane Pledge. For those of you who don't know, the CCAC was founded over a decade ago, convened by UNEP and 6 nations, and that we're now over 70 nations as part of our coalition. A great many of them are GMP signatories, although some of them are not. Over 100 IGOs, multilateral development banks, and NGOs also participate in the CCAC, and we focus on integrated action on climate and air pollution. Methane is one of the key short-lived climate pollutants that we address, and that's why we initiated the creation of the Global Methane Assessment and are helping to facilitate and operationalize the GMP. I'm going to have to, I can't see the slides in front of me, so I'm going to rely a lot on my memory here. But I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing that. So is this?
It's the first one.
Okay, it's the first slide. Okay, I'll just make sure I'm in the right spot here. We've already covered what the GMP is. The CCAC is one of the key implementing agencies of the Global Methane Pledge. We are the first port of call for, do you want me to? Is that easier for you maybe, because then you can see your slides? No, this will help me because I'll just skip over the slides and I'll go faster. It'll give us more time if I can't read it. Thank you. We're the first port of call for GMP countries who are interested in operationalizing their plans or creating new plans to address methane emissions. As Johan indicated in his presentation, there is an enormous wealth of actual methane content, existing commitments in the countries of the world to address, potentially, if fully implemented, could meet the very ambitious commitment of the Global Methane Pledge. The trick is, how do you implement it? How do you pull, as Kathleen was saying, methane is not CO2. How do you pull the methane out of the CO2 commitment so that you can really truly identify what your activities are and turn them into implementation strategies that we can implement over the course of this decade? So next slide. There we go. So we are initiating what we're calling the Global Methane Roadmap Development Program in the CCAC. The objective of this is to serve as a short-term onboarding portal for countries interested in developing methane action plans and being part of the broader CCAC community. The objective here is that we work with countries over this year and next year to develop their methane action plans or roadmaps to really articulate and understand what data they have, what strategies they have, what their priorities are, hopefully enhance and expand on those where we can, but by the end to really have implementation strategies in place that we can mobilize very quickly and attach to resources. We have through this program a process which I will describe in the next slide, which will allow us also to have countries develop these plans in a harmonized and transparent way that allows for common evaluation and aggregation between countries so that we can actually track our progress towards achieving this commitment. But I should point out, track this progress in a way that's not onerous or additive to existing processes. For example, the new transparency mechanism of the Paris Agreement, as was mentioned earlier by Lily. The intention is not to establish an MRV system that is duplicative of that. The intention is to support that existing process, but make sure that methane is sufficiently articulated in a transparent way to allow us to really plan around methane mitigation while supporting the broader climate agenda. So next slide. We are the Methane Roadmap Development Program is built around what we're calling 5 building blocks. These are drawn from over a decade of national planning work that Johan and his team have been intimately involved with over the last decade through our SNAP initiative, now National Planning Hub. We've broken down the components of national planning into these 5 building blocks, and the idea here is that instead of forcing countries to develop completely independent methane action plans as part of their commitment to the GMP, we want to meet countries where they are. There are plenty of plans, strategies, and commitments that exist on the ground that are hopefully sufficient or at least make a major step towards meeting the global methane commitment. The problem is that they're not necessarily articulated in a way that you can actually strategically plan as a policymaker, as a business, as a reporter to an international commitment like the Paris Agreement in a transparent way. So these building blocks are designed as the different components of methane action planning. And go to the next slide, please. Let me just articulate what those are. So they are 1, inventories, building block 1. 2, analytics, that's analyzing your mitigation potentials and identifying the impacts and benefits, hopefully quantifying the multiple impacts and benefits of different strategies or policies. 3, establishing targets. I would say, I know targets are a scary word in this community, but every country's already established a target. It's in your NDC. You just may not know that there's a methane target inside of that commitment. And by pulling out methane and really looking at it strategically, you can identify what you've already committed to as a nation as part of your net GHG commitment. And that can be a fundamental building block or starting point for your methane action planning. The 4th building block is policies and measures, so that's really articulating the policies and the implementation strategies that you need to put in place to really turn towards implementation once you've identified where you're going and what your targets are, and then finally making sure that you have a strong MRV component. And again, this is MRV as much as possible that's completely hand in glove with existing MRV systems in the UNFCCC. There's a cherry on top, however, that we couldn't figure out how to put into a building block, and that's the national context. That's really something that probably you're not going to get from existing commitments or legislation, and that's just a description of the context of your country, why you're part of the GMP, what your institutional and legal frameworks and structures are, where are the responsible parties who are responsible for implementing different components. So. I've never been accused of being brief. I apologize for that, but I'm going to try to be very quick. One last slide here. This is how we're operationalizing the program component. So 1, we have a TIGER team or a technical implementation team that's made up of, or we're still establishing it, but it's made up of implementing agencies who have key expertise in one or all of the building blocks, in one or all of the regions of the world, who will be supporting countries going through this process, helping them identify the data, helping them implement entire action plans if they want, or just working in bespoke ways on particular elements. The program itself is split into 2 components. 1, we'll be running a series of workshops on each of the building blocks before COP. And in between those, there will be expert consultations with members of the Tiger teams or others who are interested, institutions that have resources or are interested in participating in this process. Will be able to provide direct service to countries where we see maybe they're lacking in a particular area. There's a gap that can be filled rather quickly. For example, let's say you're in a country and you've identified that you don't have a waste sector tier 2 methane inventory. It's pretty critical for doing national planning on methane. In the waste sector, that's a gap that could be identified relatively quickly through this process, and we would be able to pair either with a member of the Tiger team or another member of our expert community with that country to actually fill that gap. There are some resources available in the CCAC. One of them is a small-scale strategic financing mechanism. It's $20,000 to $25,000 that can be requested by a country for targeted expert assistance to support this process. And we also have a broader SLCP program where we're giving out $9 million this year to support national action, sectoral action, and the implementation of our sectoral engagement strategies through our hubs. There's one more slide, but we're going to skip right past it. I guess I was just explaining we're building out the agenda here. You can take a picture of this Gantt chart. This is kind of our idea of the timeline of rollout in this year. But the times for these workshops are subject to change based on availability and resources. So. Anyone who's, actually, can you go to the last slide? Yes, anyone who's interested in more information, please either go to the Global Methane Pledge website or the CCAC website. We're very happy to connect with you, either if you're interested in being part of the technical community or if your country is interested in participating in this program. We're expecting robust participation and are excited to work with you.
Thank you, Nathan. Why do you call it a Tiger team? It's a nice name.
It's an artifact from the Montreal Protocol, actually. Okay. And the history, it's lost to the fog of history, unfortunately. But no, it was back technical teams, technical groups that are brought together to address specific problems or within the ozone, stratospheric ozone protection community. Okay, I just stole it from there.
Okay, that's nice. So that means that so the countries which have are part of the pledge, they can turn to you for first advice. Especially also when they don't know exactly whether or not they have some methane within their existing NDC, that I understood correctly. But the advice is only for those countries who are part of the pledge and not the ones who haven't joined yet.
Right now, yes. So it's for CCAC partners and non-partners who are GMP signatories at this point, okay, to help them operationalize the pledge.
One thing, because CCAC is about clean air, and we have been talking about, the climate impacts and mitigation impacts of reducing methane, but how exactly is, again, the connection to the clean air? I mean, we talked already about health and ozone, but maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely, and just to actually, so Kathleen was talking about this earlier, but it's worth highlighting the point. Most of the countries that operate and have joined the CCAC have, well, they all have different reasons for joining, but a great many of them have joined not specifically for the climate benefit. They've joined for the development benefits, particularly the clean air benefits that can be derived from really integrating your planning around climate and clean air and prioritizing actions that achieve net benefits across that spectrum. So methane, the problem with methane that we saw 3 years ago is that it's actually, it's well understood for the most part what the climate impacts for methane are, and it's somewhat well understood that methane contributes to the formation of tropospheric ozone, which is a greenhouse gas and a powerful air pollutant. To make the direct connection between a change in methane and a change in ozone, you had to go to a model. You had to do modeling. It wasn't the same as if you were talking about fine particulate matter air pollution. You could say, oh, it's, we expect we're going to make this change in a system. It's going to reduce emissions in this way. We expect the concentrations will change in this way, and then you can pretty quickly translate that into public health impacts and benefits. With methane, you always had to go to a model in between to model how the ozone impacts were going to, how ozone was going to change. So we said, hey, we're climate and clean air. We want to make that connection. So that was the genesis of the global methane assessment, is actually we did the modeling that allows us to, that we now have the ability to automatically translate a change in methane to a change in ozone. And what's really, a couple of things about that. I'll say a couple of things that will get everybody excited, I guess. So, I mean, one, we know that methane is not CO2. In this community, right, there are very few ways in which methane and CO2 are equivalent. They're equivalent in some very important ways, and they're completely non-equivalent in other ways. For example, if you were to hold out your hands like this and imagine in your mind's eye that I were to place a molecule of CO2 in one hand and a molecule in methane in the other, I guarantee you could not tell the difference. But, and I know for those people watching from home, you can't see this, but if you look behind you at this green area outside of this building, if you were to place a molecule of CO2 and a molecule of methane on two different leaves, I guarantee those plants would know instantaneously which one was CO2 and which one was methane. CO2 is a fundamental component of photosynthesis. Methane is not. Methane contributes to the formation of ozone, which kills plants. So CO2 emissions actually facilitate plant growth in some ecosystems, and methane emissions facilitate plant death around the world. They're not equivalent in that space. And let's say you're trying to take on a global problem that's happening everywhere all the time forever, and the only way to change it is to change everything all the time forever. You need to convince everybody all the time forever in a variety of different ways to take action. One of those ways to convince them is that your children are dying of asthma attacks and your plants are dying from exposure to ozone. And you can't make that story, you can't tell that story if you think methane is CO2, right? That it can't be done. And that's why we made that link. I had one more statement there, but I think that was probably
maybe later in the
enough.
discussion.
I'll bring up something else. But,
yeah, I can ask this question later
yes.
on. Thank you, but I think this is again a very important information. You also, I mean, what does that mean that, you know, it's not CO2 and this kind of, you know, to have in the head they are killing, methane is killing plants is not a very nice one, imagination we can have. Let me now turn to my last panelist, that is Jörg Linke. He is a colleague from GIZ and he is the head of the Competence Center for Climate Change in our sectoral department. And you have a background in forestry science, in forest management, in the tropics and in the subtropics. You have 25 years of experience in development cooperation, and you have been working in a couple of countries. That is in Africa, you have been working in Cameroon, you have been working in Ecuador and Tunisia and Costa Rica, so all around the world. And you will give us some now concrete examples and experiences in different countries where the countries already started to do something about their methane emissions. So floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Vera. Thank you for the question and the opportunity to present some concrete project examples from GIZ projects that aim at mitigation methane emissions, either as a secondary target or as a major target. I would say, despite the rather recent hype or push for methane emission reduction, there are several initiatives and projects that have been already implemented for years, not only by GIZ, but as well from other institutions. We heard already that most human-caused methane emissions come from just three sectors: the agricultural sector, fossil fuels and waste, including solid waste and wastewater. We have gathered, as GIZ, a lot of experience in all of these three sectors, except energy, since we hardly implement projects in fossil fuels as GIZ. Looking at the most important sector with regard to its contribution to the global methane emissions, it is agriculture, in my opinion. Emissions here stem from livestock enteric fermentation, livestock manure, and rice cultivation. We heard this already. We have seen the video from the two projects in Thailand. One is the NAMA project and the Thai German climate program, and learned that alternate wetting and drying provides a proven solution to significantly reduce methane emissions without decreasing yield. I think this is very important to underline that there is no decreased yields. In addition, the NAMA project is promoting the introduction and dissemination of other technologies, like, for example, laser land leveling, site-specific nutrition management, or straw and pest management. The application of these practices altogether have shown to be very effective mitigation actions and at the same time increase yields and improve the quality of rice farmers. The NAMA fund or NAMA funds are being used for set up different financial schemes to incentivize such technologies and increase the purchasing power of farmers. The Thai-German climate program has focused a lot of its work on the establishment of MRV. We heard that data is very necessary for the rice sector and presented in the video. Data collection from farmers is currently in progress to verify estimated measurements. Moreover, both projects strengthen capacity through training activities and the establishment and application of sustainable agricultural standards. So far for the presentation of the first question.
The technologies you mentioned seem to have a lot of potential for upscaling and replication in other countries. I mean, there are so many rice-growing countries in this world, so I guess that the experiences about this project, from the NAMA facility, Thai rice, can be replicated. But you said beside rice, the livestock sector is another one which is a major contributor to methane emissions. My impression is that there's still a lot of research underway in the livestock sector. So is it as easy as in the rice sector, or where do we stand there?
Yeah, thank you for the question. You're very right. Let me explain it regarding a global project GSZ is implementing, a so-called program for climate-smart livestock systems, implemented in several African countries, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, among others, together with our partners, the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, and the World Bank. The project is part of a special initiative, One World, No Hunger, financed by the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ. To underline, in Africa, the agriculture sector is the largest source of GHG emissions. About 70% of the agricultural emissions are related to livestock. At the same time, livestock farmers are struggling with changing climate conditions. Livestock farming plays an important role for food security in Africa and supports the livelihoods of about 1/3 of Africa's population. The project works on both mitigation and adaptation. So let us have a look at our second video. Mrs. Polly Eriksson from the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, gives us a very brief overview of what the project does to mitigate methane emissions.
My name is Polly Eriksson. I work for ILRI based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm here to talk to you about the Program for Climate Smart Livestock, which, as the name implies, targets the livestock sector. This project contributes to the reduction of enteric methane by baselining emissions from a range of smallholder systems in these three countries. This allows us to better understand emissions and entry points for methane mitigation strategies. We are also testing actual strategies to reduce methane from livestock in our laboratory in order to validate the models that are currently used to calculate emissions factors and to get a more accurate idea of how much methane can be reduced from a given strategy. Our project activities do interlink with climate change policies in all three countries, and Kenya and Uganda have signed the Global Methane Pledge. We set up our own data collection protocols to support Tier 2 calculations for MRV systems. The governments of Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia all have MRV systems under development, and in some cases they've been piloted, but there is no formal systems yet currently widely used. And there is potential to replicate our approach across Africa with greater access to finances and information. My name is Polly Erickson. I work for ILRI based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm here to talk to you about the Program for Climate Smart Livestock, which, as the name implies, targets the livestock sector.
I think this is repeating.
This project contributes to the reduction of enteric methane by
I think there was something went wrong.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Okay, maybe Vera.
I think
So
the basic message
yes.
we got.
So maybe coming back to your question, you're completely right. It's true that there is a lot of research on climate smart practices in livestock sector going on. To tackle methane emissions, different mitigation strategies have been tested and developed, including improved feeding with legumes, silage, concentrates, and practices for low emission manure management. So there is a lot of research ongoing. It's a different situation than with the rice sector.
So now we had two examples from agriculture, that is rice and also livestock, but beside energy as a source of methane emission, we also have the waste sector. So do we also have some already practical experiences somewhere in this world to deal with this challenge?
Yes, we have several waste management projects carried out by GIZ. One is the NAMA facility-funded waste solutions for a circular economy in India. India's urban population is expected to rise to around 600 million by 2030 and even up to 800 million by 2050. Everyone can imagine that all these peoples will produce a lot of waste. The municipal solid waste management system in India is largely limited to dumping mixed waste streams in unmanaged dump sites, leading to significant greenhouse gas emissions. The project aims at transforming the municipal solid waste management sector in India by promoting low carbon waste management solutions like biomethanation, composting, and recycling. Let's watch the video from our Indian colleagues that briefly introduced their project.
Let's give it another try.
The NAMA facility-funded Waste Solutions for a Circular Economy in India project aims at transforming the Indian waste management sector by promoting low-carbon waste management solutions. As per the third biennial update report submitted by Government of India to the UNFCCC, landfilling of municipal solid waste generates around 15 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions annually. This project is promoting solutions that help avoid landfilling through three main components. First component is technical assistance to support implementation of innovative and locally appropriate low-carbon waste management technologies. Second, grant funding mechanism. Third, risk-sharing facility that will provide partial loan guarantees to waste sector entrepreneurs. The project aims at supporting 1.2 million tons of emission reduction. The project activities are aligned with India's climate change mitigation strategies. Particularly, these are aligned with the Swachh Bharat mission or the Clean India mission.
Landfilling of waste releases methane due to the decay of the organic matter in waste by anaerobic bacteria. In case of biomethanation plant, methane is generated, but it is captured, cleaned and used for electricity generation or heat production. In case of composting, aerobic bacteria degrade the waste to release carbon dioxide in place of methane.
Yeah, thank you. So that was another example.
Yeah. Maybe to summarize what he said and some impressing dates, as a result of the project, it is expected to support the reduction of around 1.2 million tons of CO2 equivalents emissions over a period of 5 years. Although we heard that CO2 is not methane, considering that most of the emissions reductions will be due to the avoidance of landfillings. The project is reducing around 420 million tons of CO2, of methane over the period of 5 years. I think this is somehow impressive. And if I can make one more remark, besides solid waste, there is also a significant potential to reduce methane emissions in the water and wastewater sector, as seen in our ICI project, Water and Wastewater Companies for Climate Mitigation, the WACLIM. in our partner countries, Peru and Mexico, the reduction of methane emissions accounts for the major share of climate protection effects. For example, our partner utility in Cusco, Peru, has reduced around 28 million tons of CO2 equivalents through improved sludge management and installing the country's first wastewater biogas plant. The emissions are equal to more than 20,000 passenger flights from Germany to Peru and back. So the avoidance and reduction of methane emissions often comes with strong environmental and financial co-benefit. For instance, the air quality in the surrounding areas of the wastewater treatment plant in Cusco improved considerably, and utilities are saving electricity costs as they are now producing electricity from biogas.
Thank you. That's very promising, all these examples in the different sectors. Well, because everybody kept to its 10 minutes, we have some space for questions from the audience. So I can imagine, because we have heard about the political setting, about the science, about the roadmap and the support CCAC is giving. We also heard about the reporting and what can be done here, and the roadmap. So I imagine that there are some questions, and I also already saw a lady's hand going up. Please.
Yes. It's on? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. I'll try to get up. My name is Olga Gassenzada. I'm with Carbon Limits, and people who work with methane tend to know our name. And we work a lot on methane. We just, this Thursday, last Thursday from here in Bonn, delivered the first methane management seminar in Turkmenistan, the country that badly is in the forefront of the fight against methane emissions. I think I wanted to ask a question, but also initially add some corrections to what was mentioned specifically by the State Department, who is not here with us anymore. About the oil and gas methane mitigation being, 50% of it being at net zero cost. That's not really what we see. It's not, the graph is not like this. It's not 45%. It's more like you see some activities that are extremely beneficial to mitigate, then very large scale, very small activities that are bothersome, and countries don't bother to do anything because they don't really see any financial benefit. There is a cost, even though economically they might be. They might pay back at some point, and they're very expensive activities that you mitigate. We actually go to the ground. We go to oil and gas facilities. We measure things. We see things. We advise companies on mitigation. And the question here is how do we manage these emissions? Because what we see a lot of emissions. We know where they are, but we don't see the finance that will come to address these emissions. We have just negotiated in Glasgow Article 6 mechanism. Actually, I think I saw some colleagues from the Article 6 negotiation team. We negotiate mechanisms that are not applicable to methane, because methane emissions in oil and gas happen in countries that would be outside of the ambitious baselines and the Paris alignment goals that we have set up for these mechanisms. There's no other finance that goes into it, and the companies are not investing this because it actually costs. It might look on paper as if these measures, pay back, but in reality, they cost effort. Somebody needs to make these decisions. So I don't know if the panelists are aware or are working maybe on setting up any instruments. I guess some other non-market mechanisms that might work towards reducing methane emissions in oil and gas. Because what we see is that even straightforward investment right now in oil and gas is difficult because, of course, it's fossil fuels. And what we see is that the methane is not mitigated.
Thank you so much. We can take another question, and then we come back to the finance issue.
Hello. So I am just curious about that. In the Global Methane Pledge, we have decided to reduce 30% from the base year 2020. So I am curious why we have selected the 2020 as the base year, because every country has a different type of methane emissions and different type of mitigation measures they have taken in their country. So I think we are ignoring the historical cumulative emission, what have occurred. Some developed countries have already emitted the methane emissions. Some are now, means they have a different peaking years of the methane. And the another link question is that most of the countries have declared their net zero emission for around 2050. So in the net zero, they have to reduce the gas emission from all the gases, not from only methane. So how this methane pledge will help to, it is, I think, only a part of that we are achieving net zero, or it will majorly, I mean, we can say maybe methane help, or because as far I know that methane is a very short lifetime of 12 years something compared to CO2. So I want to understand what is that methane is linked with.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question from the virtual space?
No.
Not yet. Okay, then we take these two. First comes the finance question. I don't know whether one of you has an insight into upcoming funds for assisting countries to go about reduction of methane emissions. Nathan, do you have an idea?
I can answer part of that question, I suppose. So financing methane mitigation in the oil and gas sector is particularly a sticky issue. It's hard to get money to do that. And it's a challenge that we're trying to figure out, and particularly within UNEP, we're working with GCF to see if we can get some funding, particularly for the coal mine sector. Abandoned coal mines, for example, don't have the same kind of economic argument for being able to mitigate that using private sector funding. But we do recognize that as a challenge, and when we're trying to figure out, we do the World Bank and many multilateral development banks are partners of the CCAC, and we're working with them on dedicated methane funds, and the World Bank has implemented quite a few. Their methane pay for performance auction program was actually really quite effective, and we're trying to get them to re-inject funding into that mechanism. Within the CCAC, we have very limited funding, but are supporting as many countries as we can, particularly on national planning and action. And then, of course, there's the Methane Hub Philanthropic Fund, the $322 million that were put together to support countries to take rapid action in the next 3 years. Hopefully that will continue, but obviously will not be sufficient. We need substantially more from governments. I agree with that.
Yes, thank you so much. And there's also the NAMA facility. We have already heard that some of the projects which were presented here, the ICI, the International Climate Initiative of the German government, of the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Change. So this is part of the answer, I would say, but maybe there needs to be done more, I don't know. Good, and then we come to the baseline question. Who is going to that question? Kathleen, maybe?
I don't think I can answer the baseline question, but I wondered if I could add on to this question about oil and gas facilities and how to get them to reduce their methane. Of course, financing would be desirable, but there's other ways to achieve emissions reductions, and that would simply be regulations or other approaches. So for instance, in the US context, I used to be at the EPA, so I have some familiarity with it. There's leak detection and repair rules under the US Clean Air Act that are actually intended to target more toxic air pollutants, volatile organic compounds, for instance, and they just have to do that. It's part of their cost of doing business. There's also a European methane strategy. It came out a bit before the Global Methane Pledge, and I'm not going to be able to say anything about the details, but one point of discussion there was Europe is in general an importer of natural gas, so how can it exert influence on, let's say, how well its producers or the people from whom it's buying from are doing on the environmental front, and so it could also be considered to develop certain technical standards to require and require that they be met as a part of a purchasing condition. Of course, global geopolitics also plays a role, and it makes things complicated there. Regarding the 2020 baseline, I don't know, maybe,
Nathan or Johan?
Just very quickly, so the decision there to make it a 2020 baseline is to set it on an historical number, not on some future projection. Also, I guess, just to clarify there, that's a global commitment. It's not an actual commitment by each individual country to reduce 30% compared to their 2020 levels. It's to collaborate and to achieve that as a global commitment. And methane, as you were saying, because it's got a much shorter lifetime than CO2, the issue of cumulative methane emissions is less of an important issue than it is for CO2, cumulative emissions being. It's the rate of annual emissions with methane that's the critical issue. If we can turn down the taps, we can really quite radically change the course of methane forcing going forward. One final point actually about the net zero commitments. So at least in terms of 1.5 consistent mitigation pathways, methane never has to get to zero, ever. It doesn't even get close. CO2 does by 2050, absolutely, and well below it. Almost no other climate forcer goes to zero. So net zero commitments don't need to be net zero everything. And I think that's actually an important articulation because it leads to some really strange conclusions, particularly in the agricultural sector, where it is quite challenging right now, not impossible, but challenging to achieve methane mitigation. They don't have to go to zero. They have to do a lot, but they never have to go to zero, so they shouldn't panic about that. It's really about, net zero is really about CO2. The rest of the climate forces have to come down. They have to come down dramatically and fast, but net zero is really a CO2 commitment.
So that was another very important message, I would say. Johan, do you like to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, of course, the Methane Pledge is focusing on 2030, as do the NDCs. But in the global methane assessment, there we looked at it slightly differently, but looked at the IPCC report to give us guidance on what level of methane reduction will be compatible with 1.5 degrees C. And that's, from the assumed increase in emissions that would occur in 2030, it's a 45% reduction that is most compatible. The Global Methane Pledge is just on that, sort of the top of the envelope of what would be 1.5 compatible. And so ideally we do more than 30% globally. But the other thing I was just going to mention that beyond 2030, that's not the end. It has to continue down. So, the Global Methane Pledge is a start, but it's certainly not the full story. We need to keep reducing methane beyond 2030.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you so much. I think we have another question, and then we come to our last two questions, and then we come slowly to an end.
Hi, I'm a reporter from India. So I was wondering if there are any concrete examples of a methane leak.
Can you put down your mask a little bit for this minute because it's difficult to understand?
Yeah. Yes. So I was wondering if you have any concrete examples of plugging methane leaks from the oil and gas sector or any other initiatives that directly target the oil and gas industry, because it's coming from India or even from Asia, hearing about rice farming and cattle is very strange because these are survival emissions. You can't compare survival emissions to industrial methane and the amount of, even the amount and also the kind of livelihood that it supports. So it's very different. So you can't compare the two. So I would like to hear more concrete examples of actual methane leak plugs and what you can do in the oil and gas sector specifically, because even the IEA has said that this is the lowest fruit. This is the lowest hanging fruit. That you can also save some of your cost if you plug these leaks, because then you have more oil and gas to sell. So I think we should be talking a lot more about this sector and about strategies to effectively combat leaks here, at least leaks to start with, and then production. And then we can start talking about livestock and cattle farming and cattle and rice farming.
Thank you so much. And then the last question, please. Here in front.
Thank you so much. Mario Finch from the World Resources Institute. And I'm just going to play a little devil's advocate here. Given the fact that the US and the EU are the major drivers behind this Global Methane Pledge, Johan, you were going through some analysis. How are they doing in terms of dealing with methane in some of their NDCs or any of the other policies, actions, or measures that you may have analyzed? So that's one. Are there any other countries that are making greater headway? And if so, what are those countries? And then for you, Nathan, it's one thing to have money available, but in terms of speed of access, given the fact that you mentioned the $20,000 to $25,000 to support countries, like how quick could countries get that money to be able to start with their initiatives towards methane?
Good, thank you. Because we have now 10 minutes left, maybe we can do it that way, that we are trying to answer these questions and, you know, have a final statement from each of you. Maybe we can start with Johan. Do you, for example, from your insights into different countries, do you have an example in the oil and gas sector? Maybe you can take that question or any other, and then also combine it with your maybe final statement, Johan. You would like to start?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the oil and gas sector is put forward as one where there's an assumption that rapid progress can be made. Now, I take the point that, you know, if it was really, really simple to do it, why hasn't it been done already? So there are some barriers there, but they're considered to be lower because you're dealing with a relatively small number of companies and sources compared to other sources of methane. So, but it still needs to happen. But I think that, you know, it's interesting to see how people react to the identification of big methane leaks, that they do manage to sort of close them down pretty quickly. There's some work from the use of satellites where they've identified methane emissions, told the sources that there's a methane emission going on, and then, you know, within a month it's gone. So that shows that there is potential to reduce emissions substantially. And I think there are, parts of the world where the oil and gas emissions have been successfully reduced substantially. So it's a question of doing that. But we'd have to address the barriers and find finance and other ways of doing that. In terms of the question about the US and EU, so one of the problems is the lack of targets for methane specifically from most countries. You know, there are very few actual methane targets. There is only, we're gleaning from the NDCs, you know, the actions that countries have said and what proportion of emissions will be covered by that. The US does have a methane reduction plan, but it would be really useful to have more transparency in what all countries are planning to do in terms of methane specifically. So I think that's really important. And if you want me to finalize some final remarks, I'd say, well, following on from that, please separate methane from CO2 and NDCs. You know, express the mitigation in tons of methane. Then we can answer those questions much more easily about how much people are doing. And it is clear that, you know, there's a lot of methane which is not included in EU and US plans. So there's a, you know, greater ambition possible than is expressed already. So we need to add those methane measures if they're not included in the NDC. That's my second final remark. Then I'd say add further measures in countries where there's the opportunity to include actions in sectors where measures are missing. And then countries do need to ask for help to improve their capacity to enhance their methane mitigation. So there is support being made available, and it needs to, the countries need to use that to improve their capacity and identify the multiple climate, health and development benefits of mitigation. And finally, I'd say we need to further develop the tools and methods to understand what these wider benefits of implementation are to try and raise ambition.
Thank you.
So those are my final remarks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Johan, and now to Nathan. Do you want to also add to US or?
Yes, a couple of things. So one, oil and gas emissions are measures in the oil and gas sector are not low-hanging fruit. For the most part, they're fruit that's already been picked. They're in boxes. They need to be put in the truck. Someone needs to get in the truck and drive it to the market. There are a great many measures that are literally about tightening bolts. about walking around an oil and gas production and distribution and transport facility and checking for leaks and tightening nuts and bolts. I mean, you would be amazed at the amount of methane that can be eliminated in terms of fugitive emissions by very, very simple, low-cost measures. There are some that are enormously expensive. There are some that are incredibly cheap. I do take the point that you made about survival emissions to heart. I think that's an important framing, and it is true. We need to be looking at the places where there's an enormous amount of money being made first to get the mitigation down. The problem with particularly the agricultural sector and the production sector is, one, a lot of the measures are about changing practice. A lot of it's about consumer behavior shifts. It takes time. We can't wait. We have to start now to generate momentum. I mean, we live in an and also world, not an either or. We don't get to pick anymore. We got to do it all. But we do need to do it in a way that's humane and complies with our broad sustainable development objectives. So the point about survival emissions, I think, is very well taken. Mario, on the point of access and speed of access, at least with this small development fund within the CCAC, it requires a country to make the request. We make those decisions internally. It's a process that can be done within a matter of weeks. I know the gears of the UN don't grind slowly, so a matter of weeks is literally light speed. But and maybe it would be, seems unachievable, but it is something we can do. A lot of money needs to be mobilized right now, and it's taking a long time to do it. But at least in that instance, we can achieve it. My final remarks. I think Johan hit the right ones there. I guess the one remark I want to make is, well, maybe I came down a little harsh on the fact that methane is not CO2, particularly within this community that works within particularly a framework of climate pollutants being fungible. There are plenty of instances where climate pollutants can be fungible and equivalent to one another. There are plenty of instances where that is completely inappropriate to do. The trick is that once you aggregate everything into a carbon dioxide equivalent number, you can't disaggregate. If that's the only thing you've got, you can't rewind that without making a lot of assumptions. You need the underlying information, the raw data in tons or metric or mass units, whatever, for all of the net climate pollutants that you're putting out there and the change that you're expecting. And once you have that information, you can do, oh my God, an incredible number of things. But if you aggregate it all and you're only working with CO2e, that limits you to just a very small subset of benefits that you're working with or communities that you can work with. So, when I say methane is not CO2, I'm not saying you can't turn it into CO2e. Multiply it by 24. If you want to use AR5, multiply it by 29 if you want to use AR6. It's really easy to turn it into carbon dioxide equivalents. But start with the tons because you can do some really amazing things with it now. My final point here, and this is the one I forgot earlier, the really cool thing about methane and the link of methane to air pollution is that air pollution, at least from a regulatory standpoint, historically is about local and regional controls. Methane is a well-mixed greenhouse gas. It's not a local and regional problem. So it's always been part of the climate community, and air pollution control authorities have never seen it as within their remit because it goes everywhere. You put it up here, it goes all over the planet eventually before it's removed from the atmosphere. But we can link it down to tropospheric ozone, which is a local and regional air pollutant. And it means that, unlike, for example, an air pollution control that works on PM2.5, where the vast majority of the benefits from an action that reduces emissions of PM2.5 are enjoyed in the locality where that reduction occurs, which is a good thing, right? Methane is different. A ton of methane reduced in Bonn will have an impact on tropospheric ozone formation in Bogota. A ton of methane reduced in Frankfurt will have an impact on ozone formation in Paris, Texas. That is a really cool connection that we have not done enough with. We really need to think about how methane really makes in a truly global way connects the local and regional air pollution to this global mitigation objective that we have. That is not the same story that we have when it comes to other types of air pollutants.
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat what you said because it was clear enough, I think, and we are running a little bit out of time. No, it was important. I mean, yeah. Jörg and then Kathleen, please.
Thank you. Mario, finish your question, what is EU and US are doing? I think it is very much related to the fact that methane reduction is much more urgent for all the emerging and industrialized countries, not for the least developed or SIDs, on my opinion. If you think, for example, at the meat consumption, which is increasing still a lot, the industrial livestock management in the industrial countries, or the waste and wastewater level, which we have here, I think this underlines very clearly that it's much more important for us and for the emerging countries. As final remarks, on my opinion, to achieve a successful methane reduction, I think we have to bring together 3 or 4 aspects. One is capacity development, sensitization in the different countries, combined with technical cooperation, in my opinion. On the other hand, technology and science. I think you have to get at the basis, the data. You have to make sure that you can measure how much methane you are reducing, and science, and of course the finance aspect. It's very important, and I think the opportunity is you can combine this very much with the co-benefits of methane reduction, like for the human health or the plant health.
Thank you. Now Kathleen, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. One, just to go to this question of reducing emissions from oil and gas, I want to support what Nathan said. So you can picture it as like, it's plumbing. So you transport gas around, and every time there's a bend, every time there's a joint, every time there's a storage container, there's a potential for leaks. And that part of it is pretty basic. It can be trickier to detect leaks. There's been advances there really using infrared cameras, for instance, also detecting leaks from satellite. Flaring is a bit of a more tricky issue, but there's also solutions, because flaring happens when essentially when you're doing extraction and there's a high pressure situation and gas needs to come out and you can't not let it out because of safety considerations, because of explosions. But basically, to put that in a bigger context, one thing I want to emphasize, which hasn't been said so much here, is back in 2011, UNEP, UN Environment, produced a big report on reducing black carbon and methane, and how that would be beneficial for climate as well as air quality and health, and also listed specific measures for how to do that. So the measures for methane reduction that we're talking about, all of them are technically feasible. They're based on existing technologies and existing practices. So it's not about inventing some new silver bullet in that sense. It's really about implementation. How do we get these solutions in place on the ground? And that's where things like a roadmap come in. Mario, to also then respond to your question, I think, in my view, in the European context, the elephant in the room when it comes to methane is looking at the agricultural sector. Unlike India, for instance, our livestock emissions I do not consider to be survival emissions. They're more luxury emissions. Nonetheless, there is hesitancy to address that from the political side. There's multiple reasons from that. Agribusiness has a lot of power. Consumers don't want to be told what they can eat or not eat. Europe is not the only place where this is a problem, but that is where I see that Europe can really be more ambitious.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathleen. And I think I learned a lot today. And I would like to thank again Nathan, Johan, Jörg, and Kathleen, you, and also Lily, who already left. And I hope that we can continue this discussion at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh towards the end of this year. And as we already know now, there are already some things. We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. And this is a bit promising, even though there is still a challenge here in the air. So thank you so much, and wish you a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting.
Yeah, just drop it.
That's visible.
Climate and clean air.
Yeah. So but it's.
Put on the mask again.
So you are based in Potsdam.
I'm based in